A storm is coming, and with it, the truth buried deep in the House of Secrets. Welcome to Marsh Shadow Files. I am your host, Lucien. Tell me where you're listening from. Our mystery circle keeps growing. Your comments make every case more thrilling. Let's dive in. The October afternoon light lay with particular grace across Thornfield House's Georgian facade, each long window catching the dying sun like amber held to flame. Within the drawing room, that composed sanctuary of old money and older taste, the air held the layered scents of beeswax, coal fire, and from the conservatory beyond, the humid sweetness of exotic blooms. The Persian carpet, its garden motifs worked in threads that had survived 2 centuries, seemed to echo the formal beds visible through the tall windows where box hedges traced their patient geometry against the gathering dusk. It was the sort of room that had grown elegant by habit rather than design, and on this particular evening it would serve as stage for the opening act of a drama none of its occupants had consciously scripted. Lady Venetia Blackwood moved among her guests with the assured grace of one born to command such occasions, her silver hair caught in an elegant chignon that had not shifted despite the afternoon's scholarly discussions. She possessed that particular variety of presence that marks those accustomed to being both heard and heeded, her dark eyes missing nothing of the subtle currents that flowed beneath the surface of academic discourse. At her shoulder, as constant as shadow, Miss Cordelia Vane maintained her watchful vigil, 30 years of devoted service having made her as essential to the household's functioning as the very foundations upon which it stood. "Professor Whitfield," Lady Venetia observed, extending her hand to the elderly scholar whose reputation for medieval studies was matched only by his capacity for scholarly feuds, "how delightful that you could join us despite your pressing research commitments." The professor's bow was correct to the degree, yet those who knew him well might have detected a certain stiffness in his manner, as though he approached a battlefield rather than a drawing-room. "Lady Venetia, your invitation was most gracious. I confess myself eager to examine the manuscripts you mentioned in your correspondence, particularly given your rather intriguing suggestions regarding their provenance." His words carried the weight of decades spent in academic combat, each syllable precisely chosen for maximum scholarly effect. Dr. Helena Ashford, positioned near the windows where the light most favored her still handsome features, turned from her examination of a first-edition Chaucer with an expression that might have been enthusiasm, but carried within it something rather more desperate. "Indeed, Lady Venetia, your reputation for discovering the most remarkable connections between seemingly disparate texts precedes you. I do hope you'll share your latest findings with us this weekend." Her fingers, as she replaced the volume, trembled with what might have been scholarly anticipation but suggested nerves of an altogether different variety. Sir Giles Blackwood, resplendent in his role as the charming younger brother, moved between the groups with practiced ease, ensuring that glasses remained filled and conversations flowed with appropriate smoothness. His manner was that of a man accustomed to social success, yet careful observers might have noted how his hand lingered perhaps a moment too long on his brandy glass, and how his laughter, though perfectly pitched for the occasion, never quite reached his eyes. "My dear sister has always possessed an unfortunate talent for uncovering what others might prefer to remain buried," he remarked to Captain James Thornbury, who had positioned himself near the fireplace with the unconscious authority of military bearing. Captain Thornbury's response carried the measured quality of a man who had learned to weigh his words carefully. "Lady Venetia's scholarship is renowned throughout academic circles. One can only admire such dedication to historical truth." Yet something in his tone suggested that admiration and comfort were not necessarily synonymous, and the shadows that seemed to follow him spoke of battles fought beyond the conventional theater of war. The conversation turned, as such conversations inevitably do among scholars, to questions of attribution and authenticity, subjects that might seem dry to the uninitiated, but which carried within academic circles all the explosive potential of political scandal. Lady Venetia's contribution to these discussions was characteristically incisive, her observations delivered with the satisfied precision of one who possessed information that others lacked and intended to deploy it with devastating effect. As the last of the port was poured and the fire settled into comfortable contemplation of its own warmth, Lady Venetia rose with the deliberate grace of a conductor preparing to begin a particularly complex symphony. The gentle tapping of her silver spoon against crystal brought immediate silence, expectant and absolute. "My dear friends," she began, her voice carrying easily through the suddenly attentive room, "I've recently made a discovery regarding the provenance of certain manuscripts that will, I believe, illuminate some rather interesting connections. Connections that may prove somewhat uncomfortable for those who have built their reputations upon foundations that are, shall we say, less solid than they might appear." The silence that followed this pronouncement was brief but telling, broken only by the gentle chiming of the long case clock in the hall and the whisper of autumn wind against the windows. In that moment of suspended conversation, something shifted in the room's atmosphere as though the very air had grown thinner, more difficult to breathe. Miss Vane glanced toward the conservatory door, which seemed for an instant not quite latched, though no one could recall seeing a hand upon it. The fire gave a small, bright collapse, and in its settling, the assembled company felt the first chill touch of something that had nothing to do with the October evening beyond the windows. Morning entered Thornfield House with a grey discretion that seemed to respect the manners of the place, mist rising from the formal gardens like the breath of sleeping ghosts. The conservatory, that crystal palace of Lady Venetia's botanical devotions, stood shrouded in condensation that transformed its glass walls into a veil of opacity, concealing whatever mysteries the dawn might hold within its humid embrace. From the breakfast room, with its cheerful yellow walls and collection of sporting prints, the view across the terrace revealed a world suspended between seasons, where the last roses clung to their stems with desperate beauty while fallen leaves gathered in corners like discarded correspondence. The breakfast table, laid with the spode china that had graced Blackwood mornings for 3 generations, awaited its mistress with patient formality. The silver coffee service reflected the pale morning light, and beside Lady Venetia's accustomed place, a single cup and saucer stood ready for the herbal tisane that had become her invariable morning preference. Miss Cordelia Vane moved through the morning ritual of household management with the precision of long practice, yet her usual composure carried within it a thread of unease that would have been apparent to any observer familiar with her customary manner. "Her ladyship is uncommonly late this morning," Miss Vane observed to Sir Giles, who emerged from behind his morning paper with the slightly fragile air of a man who had perhaps spent too many hours in contemplation of his brandy decanter the previous evening. His usual morning charm seemed strained, requiring more effort than custom demanded. "My sister's devotion to her orchids grows more pronounced with each passing season," he remarked, though his attempt at lightness failed to entirely mask an underlying tension. "No doubt she's been fussing over some exotic specimen since first light." Dr. Helena Ashford, whose academic enthusiasm seemed momentarily quelled by the morning's mist, glanced up from her untouched toast. "Lady Venetia struck me as most punctual in her habits. Perhaps we should inquire." Her scholarly composure carried within it something that might have been concern, though whether for their hostess or for other matters remained unclear. The conservatory door, when Miss Vane approached it with her customary morning greeting, revealed itself to be not merely closed, but locked, an unprecedented circumstance that sent the first chill of genuine alarm through the household's ordered tranquility. Her repeated knocking produced no response, save the echo of her own efforts against the glass, and the condensation that obscured the interior seemed suddenly less like morning mist than deliberate concealment. "The door is locked from within," Miss Vane announced upon her return, her voice carefully controlled, yet unable to entirely suppress the tremor of apprehension. "Her ladyship does not answer." Sir Giles rose with sudden purpose, his earlier languor replaced by sharp concern. Captain Thornbury, summoned from his breakfast, brought to the situation the methodical approach that had served him well in more conventional crises. "We shall need to force entry through the side door," he declared with military efficiency. "Jameson will have the proper tools." The forced entry, when it came, revealed a scene of such deceptive tranquility that for a moment the assembled company could scarcely comprehend its true significance. Lady Venetia sat in her customary wicker chair among the orchids she had tended with such devoted care, her morning cup cooling on the wrought iron table beside her, her face bearing the peaceful expression of one who had simply dozed off in the warm embrace of her botanical sanctuary. Yet something in the absolute stillness of her form, the unnatural angle of her head, and the faint but unmistakable bitter scent that lingered beneath the heavy perfume of tropical blooms, spoke of a sleep from which there would be no awakening. Dr. Ashford, despite her academic rather than medical training, was the first to recognize what the others had not yet allowed themselves to acknowledge. "We must summon Dr. Pemberton immediately," she whispered, her voice carrying the hollow quality of one who speaks truths too terrible for normal conversation. Professor Whitfield's reaction was perhaps the most telling of all, his usual scholarly detachment dissolving into something approaching panic as he stared at his old rival's motionless form, his handkerchief dabbing at his forehead with short, fretful movements. Dr. Pemberton arrived with commendable speed and the resigned briskness of one frequently summoned to the houses of the county. His examination, conducted with grave efficiency, revealed signs that spoke not of natural causes, but of something far more sinister. "She has been dead less than an hour," he pronounced. "There are indications I do not much like. I shall send for the police at once." As the conservatory was sealed and the household gathered in stunned silence, Miss Vane's voice carried across the morning air with desperate bewilderment. She was perfectly well last evening. Her mind was so sharp, her spirit so high in anticipation of her revelations. Captain Thornbury, whose tidy military mind noted such details, let his gaze travel from the cooling cup to the small, lacquered caddy with its careful label. The lid was closed, the honey untouched, the lemon still whole. He said nothing, but when he turned, there was a slight frown between his brows. On the wrought iron table, where a delicate teaspoon should have rested beside the saucer's rim, there was only empty space, as eloquent, for those who noticed it, as any cry of murder. The great hall of Thornfield House received Inspector Margery Allingham and Detective Sergeant Fox with the particular silence that marks ancient houses in the presence of violent death. The heraldic arms of forgotten Blackwoods gazed down from their gilded frames with ancestral disapproval, while the morning light, filtered through tall casement windows, fell across stone flags worn smooth by centuries of measured footsteps. A console table bore late dahlias in a silver bowl, their exhausted sweetness mingling with the scents of beeswax and coal smoke that spoke of generations of careful maintenance. The house presented itself with impeccable manners, yet beneath its Georgian composure lay something that made the very air seem to hold its breath. Allingham moved through these surroundings with the quiet authority that had served him so well among the educated classes, his cultured bearing allowing him to navigate the subtle protocols of upper-class tragedy without causing additional distress to an already shaken household. Beside him, Fox maintained his customary air of solid reliability, notebook ready and manner suggesting that whatever mysteries this manner might conceal would yield eventually to patient police work and methodical investigation. The conservatory, when they entered it, presented a study in deceptive tranquility. Lady Venetia remained as death had arranged her, seated among the orchids she had tended with such devoted care, her silver hair catching the filtered light like spun metal. The air held that peculiar combination of scents that marked such places: rich earthiness of tropical soil, sweet perfume of exotic blooms, and, beneath it all, that faint but unmistakable bitter note that spoke of alkaloids and careful preparation. "Note the precision of the arrangement, Fox," Allingham observed, his voice carrying easily through the humid air. The teacup sits upon its saucer, as though placed there with deliberate care rather than set down in the natural manner of one taking refreshment. His examination revealed other telling details: the absence of the customary teaspoon, the positioning of the lacquered caddy with its neat label, and most significantly, the complete absence of any disturbance that might suggest struggle or sudden alarm. Sir Giles Blackwood, summoned for interview in the drawing-room, presented himself with the careful composure of a man determined to meet tragedy with appropriate dignity. His manner toward his deceased sister had clearly been one of genuine affection, though Allinham's experienced eye detected beneath the grief a certain quality of relief that might have been unseemly in other circumstances. Venetia was devoted to her botanical studies, Inspector, Sir Giles explained, his hands steadier now than they had been the previous evening. She possessed an almost encyclopedic knowledge of plant properties, both beneficial and otherwise. It was a passion that occasionally concerned those who cared for her welfare. You refer to the potentially dangerous specimens in her collection? Allingham inquired with that blend of courtesy and persistence that characterized his method. Indeed, my sister was fascinated by the historical uses of various plants, particularly those employed in medieval medicine and, shall we say, less therapeutic applications. Dr. Helena Ashford, when her turn came, brought to the interview a nervous energy that seemed at odds with her scholarly reputation. Her expertise in medieval studies had clearly made her valuable to Lady Venetia's research, yet something in her manner suggested that their collaboration had been a source of anxiety rather than professional satisfaction. Lady Venetia's recent acquisition of certain manuscripts had excited considerable interest in academic circles, she explained, her fingers worrying at the clasp of her handbag with unconscious agitation. The implications for existing scholarship were potentially quite significant. Questions of attribution that might have necessitated considerable revision of accepted scholarly opinion. Professor Whitfield's interview revealed a man whose antagonism toward the deceased had been both professional and deeply personal. His scholarly achievements, considerable though they were, seemed somehow diminished by Lady Venetia's superior reputation, and his responses carried the bitter undertone of academic rivalry pursued beyond civilized bounds. Lady Venetia possessed an unfortunate tendency to question established scholarship without adequate consideration for the reputations built upon such foundations, he observed with barely concealed resentment. Miss Cordelia Vane, perhaps the most genuinely grieved of all those touched by the tragedy, provided insights that proved invaluable to Allinham's understanding of the household dynamics. Her ladyship had been particularly absorbed in her research these past weeks, she confided, her voice carrying the hollow quality of one whose world has been fundamentally altered. She spoke often of discoveries that would illuminate certain uncomfortable truths, though she was careful not to reveal the specific nature of her findings. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the conservatory floor, Allingham found himself contemplating the curious precision with which the murder had been accomplished. The locked door, the careful staging, the absence of struggle, all spoke of a mind both desperate and methodical. Yet somewhere in this careful arrangement lay the flaw that would ultimately betray the killer. Returning to the great hall, Allingham paused beside the console table where the dahlia arrangement had been refreshed. Among the flowers, catching the light with innocent brilliance, lay a single silver teaspoon, highly polished, entirely out of place, and somehow more eloquent than any confession. Fox glanced at his superior, but Allingham had already noted the anomaly and moved on, leaving the small mystery to add its voice to the growing chorus of questions that would soon demand their answers. The manuscript room at Thornfield House occupied the northeast corner of the first floor, where tall casement windows admitted the clear northern light that generations of scholars had found indispensable to their work. Glass-fronted presses lined the walls from floor to ceiling, their mahogany frames protecting volumes bound in vellum and Morocco leather that had survived the dissolution of monasteries and the casual destruction of wars. The air held that particular combination of scents that marked such sanctuaries: aged parchment, preservative oils, and the faintest trace of gum arabic, while upon the central oak table, scarred by centuries of careful scholarship, lay the materials that had occupied Lady Venetia's final investigations. Inspector Allingham entered this scholarly preserve with the quiet appreciation of one accustomed to moving among the treasures of civilization, while Sergeant Fox positioned himself near the door with his customary air of solid reliability. Miss Cordelia Vane awaited them beside the great table, a ring of small keys upon a black ribbon held in her gloved hands like a rosary of academic devotion. Her ladyship was most particular about the arrangement of her materials, Miss Vane observed, her voice carrying the hollow quality that grief lends to familiar routines. Each manuscript had its proper place, each note its designated position. This disorder— she indicated a half-finished letter that lay beneath a paperweight of carved jade, its elegant script bearing testimony to interrupted purpose— is most unlike her usual practice. Dr. Helena Ashford, summoned to provide scholarly context, entered the room with an eagerness that seemed at odds with the morning's tragic circumstances. Her expertise in medieval studies had clearly made her valuable to Lady Venetia's research, yet something in her manner suggested that their collaboration had been a source of anxiety rather than professional satisfaction. "The document in question is this 14th-century chronicle," she explained, indicating a folio bound in worn leather and marked with Lady Venetia's careful annotations. "It contains references to certain ecclesiastical practices that Lady Venetia believed had significant implications for modern scholarship. She was convinced, quite utterly convinced, that it provided evidence of academic misconduct that had gone undetected for decades." Allingham examined the half-finished letter with the careful attention he brought to all documentary evidence. The elegant script spoke of a tissue of scholarly lies that has gone unchallenged far too long, and promised revelations that would illuminate certain uncomfortable truths about those who have built their reputations upon foundations of deliberate deception. The letter was addressed to the editor of a prestigious academic journal, and its completion would have meant professional ruin for someone within their circle. Lady Venetia had been working quite late these past several weeks, Miss Vane confided, her usual efficiency somewhat impaired by the weight of loss. She spoke often of her responsibility to historical truth and of the damage that could be done by those who would sacrifice integrity for personal advancement. She mentioned particularly her concern about certain attributions that had been accepted without sufficient scrutiny. Professor Whitfield, when summoned to provide additional context, entered the room with the measured tread of one approaching a tribunal where the verdict had already been decided against him. His examination of the chronicle and Lady Venetia's notes carried within it the bitter recognition of exposure, his scholarly composure crumbling as he confronted the evidence of his rival's thoroughness. Lady Venetia possessed an unfortunate talent for discovering connections that others might have preferred to remain obscure, he observed with barely concealed resentment. Her approach to scholarship was rather more aggressive than many of us considered appropriate to the dignity of our profession. The manuscript room's architectural peculiarities proved as significant as its scholarly contents when Allayne's systematic examination revealed irregularities in the paneling that spoke of purposes beyond mere decoration. Miss Vane, responding to his careful questioning about the house's construction, revealed secrets that transformed their understanding of the previous night's events. The house was built upon the foundations of a much older structure, she explained, pressing a carved rosette that caused a section of paneling to swing inward with silent precision. These passages were constructed during the reign of Elizabeth, when the practice of the old faith required such precautions. They have been maintained as a matter of family pride. The hidden corridor beyond revealed itself as a narrow but serviceable route that connected the manuscript room directly to other parts of the house through paths invisible to casual observation. Allinham's torch illuminated stone walls worn smooth by centuries of use, and more significantly, recent signs of passage. A slight disturbance in the accumulated dust, and caught upon a splinter of old wood, a single thread of dark wool that might have come from any number of garments worn by the weekend's guests. Dr. Ashford's reaction to this revelation was particularly telling, her academic composure dissolving entirely as she stared into the shadowy passage, with something approaching horror. "I had no idea such roots existed," she whispered, though her manner suggested that the implications of this discovery were all too clear to her scholarly mind. The passage, when explored with methodical care, proved to connect not only to the conservatory, but to several other key locations throughout the house, creating a network of movement that could explain how the locked conservatory had been accessed without detection. Among Lady Venetia's private notes, Allingham discovered a small botanical sketch annotated with careful observations about alkaloid content and historical applications, the drawing showing remarkable accuracy despite its placement among manuscript materials rather than botanical studies. As the afternoon light began to fade beyond the manuscript room windows, Allingham found himself contemplating the curious intersection of ancient and contemporary deception that seemed to characterize this case. The medieval chronicle, with its tale of ecclesiastical fraud, provided an eerie parallel to the academic misconduct that had apparently motivated murder, while the hidden passages built to protect honest faith now served to conceal dishonest scholarship. Returning to examine the oak table where Lady Venetia's research lay spread in careful order, Allen noticed that among her papers was a list of names, each followed by terse, damning comments suggesting various forms of intellectual dishonesty. In the margin of one page, written in Lady Venetia's precise hand, were the words, "The truth will surface, as it always does, and when it does, certain reputations will not survive the revelation." The ink was fresh, the sentiment final, and in the growing shadows of the manuscript room, those words seemed to hang in the air like a prophecy that had already begun to fulfill itself with deadly precision. The private greenhouse occupied a position of particular intimacy within Lady Venetia's conservatory complex, separated from the main display by glass partitions that created a sanctuary, both humid and secretive. The air within this specialized environment carried a density that spoke of careful cultivation, rich with the green sweetness of tropical blooms yet underlaid with something more medicinal. The sharp, almost bitter scent of plants whose beauty concealed properties both healing and deadly. Copper pipes ran along the whitewashed walls like botanical arteries, maintaining the precise temperatures required by specimens that few English gardens would dare to harbor, while overhead the autumn light filtered through glass panes beaded with condensation that transformed the space into something between laboratory and temple. Inspector Allingham moved through this verdant sanctuary with the careful attention of one who understood that knowledge, like certain plants, could prove fatal if mishandled. Each specimen bore Lady Venetia's meticulous labeling, written in her precise script upon waterproof cards that detailed not only botanical nomenclature, but historical applications, revealing the scholarly depth of her interests. Here stood Aconitum napellus, its innocent blue flowers belying the deadly alkaloids within, and there Digitalis purpurea, whose cardiac properties had served both physician and poisoner throughout recorded history. A potting bench, scarred by years of careful cultivation, held the tools of her trade arranged with military precision upon a shadow board where each implement had its designated place. Miss Cordelia Vane accompanied them through this specialized domain with the reverent air of one entering a cathedral, her intimate knowledge of Lady Venetia's methods proving invaluable to their investigation. Her ladyship maintained detailed records of every specimen, she explained, indicating a leather-bound journal that lay open beside a small mortar of white stone. She was particularly interested in the historical applications of various plants, especially those mentioned in medieval texts dealing with medicine and, regrettably, less benevolent purposes. Her voice carried the hollow quality that grief lends to familiar routines, yet beneath it lay something more troubling, a recognition that her mistress's expertise had made her both formidable and vulnerable. The journal itself proved a revelation, its pages filled with observations that demonstrated Lady Venetia's systematic approach to both botanical cultivation and scholarly research. Her notes on the extraction of alkaloids from certain tropical specimens showed a thoroughness that spoke of more than casual interest, while her cross-references to medieval manuscripts suggested connections between ancient knowledge and contemporary applications that might have proved uncomfortable for those whose reputations depended upon maintaining certain scholarly fictions. In the margins, a curious cipher had been developed. Initial letters of Latin names arranged in vertical columns alongside numbers pricked delicately in violet ink, creating what appeared to be a botanical code of deadly sophistication. Dr. Helena Ashford, when summoned to provide additional context, entered the greenhouse with visible reluctance, her usual academic enthusiasm notably absent in the presence of Lady Venetia's more dangerous specimens. The humid atmosphere seemed to affect her composure, beads of perspiration appearing upon her forehead despite the moderate temperature, and her fingers worried at the clasp of her handbag with unconscious agitation. Lady Venetia had been investigating certain discrepancies in manuscript attribution, she explained, her voice carrying a tremor that had nothing to do with the greenhouse's climate. She possessed an unfortunate talent for detecting scholarly irregularities that others might have overlooked or chosen to ignore. Her recent correspondence with various academic institutions had become rather pointed in its implications regarding fraudulent research and fabricated credentials. Allinham's systematic examination of the potting bench revealed evidence of recent activity that seemed at odds with the careful order that characterized Lady Venetia's usual methods. The shadow board, with its painted silhouettes marking each tool's proper place, showed one significant absence: a small pruning knife that should have hung between the sprayer and the secateurs. More significantly, the white stone mortar bore traces of recent use, a thin varnish of dried residue that carried a bitter scent, speaking of careful preparation and deadly purpose. "The knife is missing," Miss Vane observed with the sharp eye of one accustomed to perfect order. Her ladyship never left implements out of place. It was a matter of both safety and principle in a space containing such dangerous specimens. Professor Whitfield, when his expertise was requested regarding certain medieval references in Lady Venetia's notes, brought to the greenhouse an air of barely concealed agitation that seemed to intensify in the presence of the more toxic plants. His scholarly composure, already strained by the morning's revelations, appeared to crumble entirely when confronted with evidence of Lady Venetia's systematic investigation into questions of academic integrity. Lady Venetia's approach to historical research was rather more aggressive than many of us considered appropriate to the dignity of our profession, he observed, his handkerchief dabbing at his forehead with increasing frequency. She seemed to take particular pleasure in questioning established scholarly opinion, regardless of the damage such challenges might inflict upon reputations built over decades of careful work. The most significant discovery came when Allinham's methodical search revealed a second journal, concealed beneath a collection of seed catalogues in a locked drawer of the potting bench. This private record detailed Lady Venetia's growing suspicions about various members of her academic circle, with particular attention paid to questions of fraudulent attribution and fabricated credentials that could have destroyed careers built upon foundations of deliberate deception. The entries grew increasingly pointed in their implications, culminating in a final notation dated mere days before her death. "The evidence is now complete. Certain reputations will not survive the revelation, but truth must prevail regardless of personal cost." Captain James Thornbury, summoned to provide information about his great-aunt's recent correspondence, brought to the greenhouse his characteristic military bearing. Yet something in his manner suggested that the financial pressures revealed in his private letters had made Lady Venetia's threatened revelations particularly unwelcome. His examination of her notes regarding certain medieval military documents revealed connections between historical scholarship and contemporary financial necessity that might have provided compelling motives for desperate measures. As the afternoon shadows lengthened beyond the greenhouse glass, Allingham found himself contemplating the curious intersection of botanical knowledge and academic ambition that seemed to characterize this case. Lady Venetia's expertise in both medieval scholarship and plant toxicology had made her a formidable adversary to those who would deceive her, yet that same knowledge had ultimately provided the means for her own destruction. Among the specimens that lined the greenhouse shelves, one plant commanded particular attention. A small, unremarkable specimen whose label had been recently altered, the original notation obscured by careful overwriting. The accompanying notes, when examined closely, revealed extraction methods and dosage calculations that spoke of purposes far removed from scholarly botany. Most telling of all, tucked between the pages of the hidden journal, was a pressed leaf specimen annotated in a hand that was decidedly not Lady Venetia's. Sufficient quantity prepared, timing crucial for maximum effect. The ink was fresh, the implications deadly, and in the humid silence of the greenhouse, those words seemed to whisper of secrets that had already claimed one life and might yet demand others before the truth could finally emerge from its carefully cultivated concealment. The missing pruning knife, the altered plant label, and the mysterious annotation combined to create a pattern of evidence that spoke not of scholarly accident, but of methodical murder, executed with the very knowledge Lady Venetia had spent her lifetime acquiring. The business room at Thornfield House possessed that particular quality of masculine efficiency that marked chambers devoted to figures rather than sentiment, its green-shaded lamp casting a circle of concentrated light upon the leather-topped desk, where generations of Blackwoods had conducted their financial affairs. Old ledgers stood in neat formation upon low shelves, their calf bindings worn smooth by decades of discreet handling, while upon the mantel-shelf a bracket clock maintained its quiet reproach, marking time with the persistence of compound interest. The window overlooked the east lawn, where the pale afternoon light lay like watercolor upon parchment, and within, the air carried the layered scents of paper, sealing wax, and the ghost of cigars that spoke of decisions made in careful privacy. Inspector Allen entered this sanctuary of commerce with the quiet authority that had served him so well among the educated classes, while Sergeant Fox positioned himself beside the desk with his customary air of methodical reliability. Mr. Geoffrey Colquhoun, the family solicitor, awaited them with the careful composure of one balanced between professional candor and professional caution, his well-brushed grey hair and unremarkable tie forming a sort of uniform for discretion. Lady Venetia had intended to sign a new will, Mr. Colquhoun explained, placing a document before Allingham with precise fingers. We were to meet formally on Monday morning. I was present this weekend to review certain clauses and ensure the necessary papers would not occasion undue family distress before finalization. His manner suggested that such distress was not merely possible, but inevitable. And would they have occasioned anything of the kind? Allingham inquired with characteristic delicacy. Most certainly, the solicitor replied with the mildest of sighs. The manuscript collection was to be settled upon a public trust for scholarly research. Certain annuities were to be adjusted significantly. Sir Giles's expectations would have been considerably modified, while Captain Thornbury would have found his great-aunt's generosity taking the form of long-term provision rather than immediate relief. He indicated another bundle of correspondence with infinite tact. These represent requests for financial assistance that Lady Venetia had declined, though she intended eventual help through more structured means. The papers revealed a modest but persistent tale of financial embarrassment. Not ruinous debts, perhaps, but obligations uncomfortable enough to press upon minds accustomed to easier circumstances. Lady Venetia's responses, while never descending to reproach, had maintained an inflexibility that might have seemed severe to those facing immediate necessity. Most significantly, a draft codicil bore a firm, penciled line through a bequest that would have provided substantial relief to one particular member of the household. Their examination of the hidden passages proved equally revealing. The torch illuminated stone walls, worn smooth by centuries of clandestine movement, and more tellingly, recent signs of passage that spoke of contemporary rather than historical use. Upon the inner edge of the carved panel that concealed the entrance, Alin discovered a faint residue, fine, pale, and bearing the distinctive sweet scent of plate powder. "Someone in our company maintains exceptionally high standards of cleanliness," he observed to Fox, who carefully collected the ghostly trace in a small envelope. "The sort of person who would polish away any evidence of contact, yet fails to consider that such fastidiousness might itself prove incriminating." The passage connected the manuscript room directly to the conservatory through routes invisible to casual observation, while a narrow service door concealed behind Lady Venetia's prized lilies provided access without disturbing the main entrance. The timing required for such movement spoke of intimate knowledge not merely of the house's architecture, but of its daily rhythms, the precise moments when corridors would be empty and attention directed elsewhere. In the conservatory itself, now cleared of its tragic burden, subtle evidence remained for those trained to observe it. A slight discoloration upon the stone flags near the drainage system suggested hasty cleaning, while the bitter scent that had initially seemed part of the exotic atmosphere now revealed itself as something more sinister, the lingering trace of alkaloids introduced with careful timing to mask their presence among the natural perfumes of tropical blooms. The medieval manuscript that had triggered Lady Venetia's final investigations lay open in the manuscript room, its illuminated pages speaking of ancient fraud with uncomfortable contemporary relevance. "Here," Allingham observed, indicating Lady Venetia's careful annotations, "a tale of forged permissions and altered documents, perpetrated by those who believed their positions rendered them immune to scrutiny. The patterns repeat themselves, Fox. Only the instruments change." The botanical evidence, initially so suggestive of accidental poisoning, now revealed its true character under systematic analysis. The missing pruning knife, the altered plant labels, the mortar with its telltale residue, all indicated preparation both careful and desperate. Yet somewhere in this elaborate deception lay the flaw that would ultimately betray its architect, for hubris, as Lady Venetia's medieval sources would have confirmed, inevitably contains the seeds of its own destruction. Miss Cordelia Vane appeared in the manuscript room doorway with visible distress. "Inspector, I fear there has been a difficulty. Lady Venetia's half-written letter to the journal editor, and the one I showed you this morning, it has disappeared from beneath the jade paperweight. I cannot account for its absence." The drawing-room grate yielded the answer in the form of fresh ash that bore no relation to coal, and within it, fragile as moth wings, 2 charred corners bearing the violet pricks of Lady Venetia's botanical cipher. The remnants were too slight for reading, yet their presence spoke eloquently of someone's determination that even the dead should not testify with ease. Most tellingly, the poker bore traces of the same plate powder they had discovered in the hidden passage, evidence of a careful hand that had tidied even the instruments of concealment. As the autumn afternoon faded beyond the tall windows, Allingham found himself contemplating the curious intersection of ancient and contemporary deception that characterized this case. The web of financial desperation, academic fraud, and personal animosity was tightening with each revelation, yet the identity of the spider remained carefully concealed at its center. In the gathering shadows of Thornfield House, where medieval secrets had sheltered honest faith, someone had perverted those same hiding places to conceal the most dishonest of modern crimes. The evidence was mounting with inexorable logic, but the final revelation awaited its proper moment. And Allingham, with the patience that marked his breed, was content to let truth emerge at its own measured pace, knowing that justice, like scholarship, required both precision and proper timing for its full effect. The drawing room at Thornfield House had assumed the quality of a stage awaiting its final act, the afternoon light filtering through tall casement windows with the particular clarity that seems to attend moments of revelation. The familiar furnishings, the Persian carpet with its garden motifs, the silver upon the sideboard catching fire glow, the ancestral portraits maintaining their painted vigil, had been transformed by circumstance into something approaching a tribunal where truth would finally emerge from its careful concealment. The air itself seemed weighted with expectation, thick with the accumulated secrets of a weekend that had begun in scholarly discourse and descended into murder most methodically planned. Inspector Allen positioned himself near the mantel shelf, where the family portraits seemed to observe the proceedings with ancestral interest, while Sergeant Fox maintained his customary post near the door, notebook ready and manner suggesting that whatever mysteries this manor might yet conceal would yield to patient police work. The assembled company presented itself with the dignified composure that tragedy demands of the educated classes, yet beneath their cultivated calm lay currents of tension that spoke of secrets finally approaching their moment of reckoning. Sir Giles occupied his customary chair with careful bearing, his usual charm somewhat strained by the weight of circumstances, while Captain Thornbury stood with military precision that could not entirely mask his relief at having his financial difficulties eliminated from suspicion. Professor Whitfield's scholarly composure had deteriorated visibly throughout the investigation, his handkerchief making frequent journeys between pocket and brow. Yet his antagonism toward the deceased had proven to be that of academic rivalry rather than murderous intent. Miss Cordelia Vane maintained her position near the windows, her loyalty to Lady Venetia's memory written in every line of her composed features, while Mr. Colquhoun, the family solicitor, had installed his professional neutrality upon a spindly chair and wore it like a carefully chosen tie. "Ladies and gentlemen," Allingham began, his cultured voice carrying easily through the suddenly attentive room, "we have gathered to consider the circumstances surrounding Lady Venetia's death, and I believe the time has come to illuminate certain uncomfortable truths that have remained hidden beneath the surface of scholarly courtesy and social convention." His manner carried the quiet authority that had served him so well in similar circumstances, combining respect for his audience with absolute certainty regarding the conclusions he was about to present. "The locked conservatory presented an initial puzzle," he continued, his gaze moving deliberately among the assembled faces. "Yet the solution lay not in supernatural intervention, but in the architectural peculiarities of this ancient house. The hidden passages, constructed centuries ago to shelter honest faith, were perverted to serve dishonest purpose, providing access to Lady Venetia's sanctuary without detection by those who might have prevented tragedy. He explained the faint traces of plate powder found in the passage, a minute detail that spoke volumes about the killer's fastidious nature and their attempt to erase any sign of their passage. Dr. Helena Ashford, positioned near the bookshelf where first editions stood in silent testimony to the pursuit of knowledge, displayed a composure that seemed increasingly fragile as Allaine's methodical reconstruction proceeded. Her fingers worried at the clasp of her handbag with unconscious agitation, and her academic credentials, so impressive upon first examination, had revealed themselves under scrutiny to be a carefully constructed facade. "The means of death was chosen with scientific precision and intimate knowledge," Allingham observed, his voice betraying no emotion. "Lady Venetia was murdered with a substance derived from her own collection, introduced into her morning tisane by someone familiar with both her habits and the deadly properties of her specimens. The missing pruning knife, the mortar bearing traces of residue, the altered plant labels, all point to meticulous preparation by someone with access to her private greenhouse and the specific knowledge to extract and administer the poison. The medieval manuscript, with its tale of ancient fraud, had provided the crucial parallel that illuminated contemporary deception. Here, Allingham indicated the illuminated pages. Lady Venetia discovered not merely historical interest, but contemporary relevance, evidence of academic misconduct that threatened to destroy reputations built upon foundations of deliberate falsehood. Her impending letter to the academic journal, portions of which we recovered from the drawing-room grate, would have brought professional ruin to someone whose entire career was constructed upon fabricated research and stolen scholarship. Dr. Ashford's facade finally began to crumble as Allingham's inexorable logic eliminated each alternative explanation. The plate powder upon the hidden panel, the destroyed correspondence, the precise timing required for the crime, all pointed to someone whose desperation had overcome both moral restraint and practical caution. The killer was not merely aware of the house's hidden passages, Allingham concluded with quiet finality, but possessed the particular fastidiousness to polish away their traces. The killer was not merely knowledgeable of Lady Venetia's botanical research, but had access to her private greenhouse and the expertise to prepare the fatal dose. The killer was not merely threatened by Lady Venetia's academic revelations, but had the most to lose from the exposure of a fabricated past and a fraudulent scholarly reputation. Dr. Ashford's breath caught in a sharp, audible gasp, her composure finally shattering like crystal struck by an unexpected blow. Her face, which had maintained its scholarly calm throughout the weekend's tragic events, now flushed with desperate recognition, and her hands flew to her throat as if the very air had become difficult to breathe. In the sudden, stark clarity of the moment, the elegant drawing-room seemed to tilt around her, and the true nature of the tragedy descended upon all who witnessed it, with the weight of absolute, inescapable truth. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the gentle settling of the fire and the whisper of autumn wind against the windows, while somewhere, in the depths of the ancient house, a door closed with the soft finality of secrets finally brought to light. The drawing-room at Thornfield House had assumed the quality of a courtroom where judgment would be passed, not by law alone, but by the inexorable logic of truth finally brought to light. The fire had settled into contemplative embers, its glow casting shifting patterns across the Persian carpet, while the tall windows revealed an October afternoon, fading into that particular melancholy that marks the close of tragic days. The air itself seemed weighted with expectation, thick with the accumulated secrets of a weekend that had begun in scholarly discourse and descended into murder most methodically planned. Each familiar object, the silver upon the sideboard, the ancestral portraits maintaining their painted vigil, the bracket clock marking time with relentless precision, had been transformed by circumstance into silent witnesses to the final act of a drama none had consciously scripted. Inspector Allen positioned himself near the mantel-shelf with that elegant composure which marked his approach to such moments, while Sergeant Fox maintained his customary post near the door, notebook closed now that the essential facts had been established. Dr. Helena Ashford occupied the wing chair that had been Lady Venetia's customary seat, a positioning that seemed to emphasize the tragic irony of her circumstances. Her academic composure, so carefully maintained throughout the investigation, had finally cracked to reveal the desperate woman beneath. Yet she faced her exposure with a dignity that even guilt could not entirely destroy. "Dr. Ashford," Allingham began with characteristic courtesy, "you have admitted privately to the murder of Lady Venetia Blackwood. I must ask you now to state those facts for the record in the presence of these witnesses, that we may understand the full scope of this tragedy." She lifted her head with visible effort, her hands lying still in her lap as though she had finally ceased their unconscious trembling. "It is true, Inspector. Lady Venetia's threatened revelations would have destroyed me utterly. My entire academic career, my reputation, my livelihood, my very identity, all of it was built upon work that was not entirely my own. Her voice carried the hollow quality of one who speaks from the depths of professional ruin, yet each word was measured and precise, as though she were delivering a scholarly paper rather than confessing to murder. Miss Cordelia Vane, positioned near the windows with her customary dignity intact despite her grief, provided the context that gave meaning to the confession. Her ladyship had grown increasingly concerned about certain attributions in Dr. Ashford's early work, she observed, with quiet authority. She spoke of discovering connections that seemed too convenient, too perfectly aligned with contemporary academic fashion to be entirely authentic. The medieval chronicle had provided the final evidence she required. The chronicle, Dr. Ashford continued with bitter precision, contained references that would have exposed my fabricated credentials completely. Years ago, when I was young and desperate for recognition, I appropriated the research of a colleague who had died before publication. The attribution was never questioned, and success followed success, each built upon that original deception. Lady Venetia had traced the original manuscripts to their true authors, and her letter to the academic journal would have meant not merely professional disgrace, but criminal charges for fraud. Allayne's methodical reconstruction revealed the full scope of the crime's preparation. You used your knowledge of the house's hidden passages, discovered during Miss Vane's historical tour, to access the conservatory without detection. The plate powder found upon the passage entrance betrayed your fastidious nature, even in the commission of crime, while your expertise in medieval studies had given you sufficient botanical knowledge to prepare the fatal extract. I accessed Lady Venetia's private greenhouse through the service entrance, Dr. Ashford confirmed with the thoroughness that had characterized her scholarly work. The missing pruning knife was used to score the plant stems for alkaloid extraction, then disposed of in the estate's lower river. I prepared the concentrate using her own mortar, introduced it into her tisane caddy where it would remain undetected until her morning ritual, and withdrew by the same route I had entered. Professor Whitfield, his own scholarly compromises now seeming trivial by comparison, regarded the confession with visible distress. The irony is profound, he observed with academic detachment struggling against personal horror. Lady Venetia died because she believed in truth above all other considerations, killed by someone whose entire existence was founded upon lies. Sir Giles Blackwood, contemplating the wreckage of his family's scholarly legacy, found his voice at last. My sister would have forgiven honest failure, he said with quiet conviction. She could not tolerate intellectual dishonesty, but she would have offered assistance to anyone who asked for help rather than chose deception. Captain Thornbury, his own financial difficulties now revealed as mere embarrassments rather than criminal motives, stood with military bearing that could not entirely mask his relief at having his honor restored. Lady Venetia's threatened revelations regarding my debts would have been uncomfortable but not ruinous, he acknowledged. Dr. Ashford faced complete destruction of everything she had worked to achieve. The confession's conclusion carried the weight of absolute recognition as Dr. Ashford spoke, her final words with scholarly precision. The medieval texts Lady Venetia studied so carefully tell us that fraud, once begun, demands ever greater deceptions to sustain itself, until finally it consumes everything it was meant to protect. I killed her because I could not bear to have my lies exposed, and in doing so, I became the very corruption she had devoted her life to eliminating from academic pursuit. As the afternoon shadows lengthened beyond the drawing-room windows, Mr. Colquhoun, the family solicitor, rose with professional composure intact. The scholarly trust will be established as Lady Venetia intended, he announced with quiet authority. Her manuscripts and botanical collection will serve the cause of truth she died defending, and her legacy will stand as testimony to the integrity she embodied. The ancient house, with its hidden passages that had sheltered honest faith for centuries, seemed to exhale with something approaching relief as the truth finally emerged from its careful concealment. In the growing darkness beyond the windows, the conservatory stood empty now, its exotic blooms continuing their silent growth as testimony to the enduring beauty of the natural world and the fragility of human pretense. The fire gave a small, bright collapse, and in its settling, the assembled company heard not merely the sound of burning coal, but the whisper of a reputation crumbling into ash, leaving behind only the bitter recognition that some prices, once paid, can never be recovered. The drawing-room clock chimed the hour with deliberate precision, marking not merely the passage of time, but the end of an era in which academic fraud could flourish in the shadows of scholarly respectability. Dr. Ashford's confession had illuminated more than her own guilt. It had revealed the moral corruption that could infect even the most civilized pursuits when ambition overcame integrity and when the pursuit of knowledge became merely another form of theft. In the silence that followed, broken only by the gentle settling of the fire and the whisper of autumn wind against the windows, the true cost of deception stood revealed in all its tragic finality. The morning after confession had settled upon Thornfield House with the particular quiet that follows the resolution of tragedy, a silence not merely of absence but of secrets finally laid to rest. The great hall received the pale November light through tall casement windows with something approaching serenity, its stone flags reflecting the subdued radiance that seemed to speak of truth acknowledged and justice, however imperfectly, served. The heraldic arms of forgotten Blackwoods gazed down from their gilded frames with ancestral composure restored, while upon the console table Miss Vane had arranged fresh chrysanthemums in the silver bowl, a quiet tribute to continuity in the face of upheaval. The air carried the familiar scents of beeswax and coal smoke, yet beneath them lay something indefinable that spoke of a house exhaling after holding its breath too long. Inspector Allen moved through these surroundings with the measured pace of one whose work had reached its natural conclusion, yet whose reflections upon human nature would continue long after the formal investigation had closed. The manuscript room, when he entered it for his final examination, presented a scene of scholarly order, restored yet forever altered by its role in contemporary tragedy. Miss Cordelia Vane stood beside the tall windows, her usual efficiency tempered by the hollow quality that marks those who must rebuild their lives after the foundation has been swept away. Yet her dignity remained unimpaired by grief. "The arrangements have been completed as Lady Venetia would have wished," she observed with quiet authority, her hands resting upon a leather portfolio that contained her mistress's final scholarly work. "Mr. Colquhoun has established the trust precisely according to her intentions. The manuscripts will serve the cause of academic integrity she died defending, while the botanical collection will find its proper home at the Royal Botanic Gardens, where its scientific value can be preserved under appropriate professional supervision." Sir Giles Blackwood, confronting the challenge of preserving what remained of the family legacy, brought to the discussion a dignity that grief had refined rather than diminished. His usual charm had been replaced by something more substantial, a recognition that the responsibilities of inheritance extended beyond mere financial advantage to embrace moral obligations that could not be discharged through conventional means. "My sister's reputation must remain untainted by any suggestion that her methods were anything less than impeccable," he declared with firm conviction. "The academic community will understand that she died because she refused to compromise with falsehood, not because she pursued truth with insufficient charity." Captain James Thornbury, his financial difficulties now revealed as mere embarrassments rather than criminal motives, stood with military bearing that reflected his relief at having his honor restored. The weekend's events had transformed his relationship with the family from one of dependency to one of mutual respect, his conduct under suspicion having demonstrated qualities that money could not purchase. "Lady Venetia's intended provisions would have solved my difficulties without compromising my independence," he reflected with genuine gratitude. "The trust arrangements will serve that purpose while honoring her memory appropriately." Professor Whitfield, his own scholarly compromises now seeming trivial by comparison with Dr. Ashford's systematic fraud, faced the challenge of rebuilding his reputation within an academic community that would forever associate his name with the Thornfield tragedy. Lady Venetia's approach to historical research was indeed more rigorous than many of us considered comfortable, he acknowledged with visible effort, but her results were invariably sound. Academic discourse will be diminished by her absence, and those of us who survive must ensure that her standards are maintained despite our own lesser abilities. The conservatory, when Alain made his final visit to the scene of the crime, stood transformed from a place of death into a monument to the enduring beauty of the natural world. The exotic blooms continued their silent growth with indifferent magnificence, their tropical splendor unmarked by the human tragedy that had unfolded among them. Lady Venetia's wicker chair had been removed, yet her presence seemed to linger in the careful arrangement of specimens and the meticulous labeling that reflected a lifetime's devotion to botanical science. The air within remained humid and fragrant, but the bitter undertone had dissipated, leaving only the clean, green smell of life persisting despite death. As Alain prepared for his departure from Thornfield House, he found himself contemplating the curious intersection of ancient and contemporary deception that had characterized this case. The hidden passages, constructed centuries ago to shelter honest faith, had been perverted to serve dishonest scholarship, while the pursuit of knowledge, that most noble of human endeavors, had been corrupted by personal ambition, unchecked by moral restraint. Dr. Ashford's confession had illuminated more than her own guilt. It had revealed the moral corruption that could infect even the most civilized pursuits when integrity yielded to expedience. Miss Vane appeared in the great hall as he prepared to leave, her 30 years of devoted service having prepared her for many challenges, but not for this particular tragedy. She faced an uncertain future with the quiet courage that had sustained her through decades of loyal attendance upon a demanding but beloved mistress. "The house will continue, Inspector," she observed with characteristic understatement. "Sir Giles has asked me to remain, to oversee the completion of Lady Venetia's catalogues and ensure that her work receives proper scholarly attention. One makes a house ready for absence as one makes it ready for company." As Inspector Allian's motor car disappeared down the drive that led away from Thornfield House, the ancient manor settled into contemplation of its newest tragedy with the patient endurance that marks houses that have witnessed the full spectrum of human folly and nobility. In the conservatory, the orchids continued their silent growth, beautiful and indifferent, while somewhere in the depths of the house, a door closed with the soft finality of secrets finally brought to light. The medieval chronicle, its historical significance now forever tainted by its role in contemporary murder, would find its way to scholars who could study its contents while remaining mindful of the price that truth sometimes demands from those who pursue it without compromise. And in the manuscript room, where Lady Venetia had conducted her final investigations, her legacy would endure, not merely in the documents she had preserved, but in the standard of intellectual integrity she had maintained even unto death.